biodiversity. That wouldn't have happened 30 years ago. Many of you may have been fortunate to experience the visit of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama to Vancouver last fall, and particularly to this wonderful campus. And it reminded me of the very first night His Holiness ever spoke in the West. And it was in the late 1970s, and it was at Harvard. And that same night, the legendary biologist, E.O. Wilson, was introducing at another theater, kitty corner to the Science Center where His Holiness was to speak. And Ed Wilson was introducing Norman Myers, who had just published The Sinking Ark, one of the first books to draw attention to what we now see to be as the biodiversity crisis. And naturally, all the kids were across the street to listen to His Holiness. And in apologizing from the podium to Dr. Myers for the sparse attendance, Ed Wilson, as kind and decent and inspired a man, a scholar, and a philosopher who's ever lived, literally said this, and I quote, "If even Harvard students can't get their priorities right, and they would be rather across the street listening," and I quote, "to that religious kook, you know how far we have to go to educate the public at large." Now, Ed Wilson would be the first to regret those words today. But it is indicative of the chasm that existed then between anthropologists and biologists. The biologists tended to see people as part of the problem. The anthropologists tended to see the naturalists as being elitist and misanthropic. Now, the irony, of course, is that that night I was the only student running back and forth between the two classes because I had been fortunate to have two remarkable mentors at Harvard, David Maybury Lewis, the great Americanist who created cultural survival, who always saw that activism was an essential part of the anthropological mission. And of course, the legendary Amazon explorer, Richard Evans Schultes, the man who sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery of the magic mushrooms in Mexico in 1938. And what is fascinating is that two generations or one generation later, not only have people come to understand the obvious, that the same forces impacting cultural diversity impact biological diversity, but it goes even deeper than that. Geneticists have finally proven it to be true, the central revelation of anthropology, which of course is cultural relativism, the great insight that Franz Boas gifted to the world, the insight that in its time was the sociological equivalent of splitting the atom. It was an absolute shattering of the European mind. And ironically, it was biology that finally proved to be true, that essential revelation of anthropology. So tonight I'm going to try to pull both of these things together as we celebrate both the natural wonder of the world and the wonder of our own legacy. Now, I often say that one of the intense pleasures of travel, and certainly one of the great pleasures of ethnographic research, is the opportunity to live amongst those who have not forgotten the old ways, who still feel their past in the wind, touch it in stones polished by rain, taste it in the bitter leaves of plants. And just to know that as we gather on this lovely night in Vancouver, in the Amazon, jaguar shaman are journeying beyond the Milky Way, and that in the high Arctic, the myths of the Inuit elders still resonate with meaning, and that in the Himalaya, the Buddhists still pursue the breath of the Dharma, is to remember that fundamental revelation of anthropology, and that is the idea that the world into which you were born does not exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality, the result of one set of adaptive and intellectual choices that your cultural heritage made, however successfully, many generations ago. But whether it is a voodoo acolyte in Haiti, a yak herder on the slopes of Shomonungma, Mount Everest in Tibet, an eagle hunter of Kazakhstan, or a thunderhoof shaman of Mongolia. All of these peoples teach us that there are other ways of being, other ways of thinking, other ways of orienting yourself in social and ecological, indeed spiritual space. And that's an idea that can only fill you with hope. Now, in an early book, I tried to suggest that this social web of life that envelops the planet and is as important to the well-being of the planet as is the biological web of life that you know so well as a biosphere, I coined a phrase, ethnosphere, to attempt to create an organizing principle for this realm of cultural life. And I defined the ethnosphere as being the sum total of all thoughts and dreams, ideas and intuitions, myths and memories brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. The ethnosphere is humanity's great legacy. It's a symbol of all that we've achieved and the promise of all that we can achieve as a widely creative and imaginative species. And in that book, back in 2001, I also pointed out the obvious, that the same forces that are impacting the biosphere are impacting the ethnosphere, but if anything at a far greater rate. No biologist, however pessimistic, would dare suggest that 50% of all plants and animals are moribund, because it simply is not true. And yet that, the most apocalyptic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity, scarcely approaches what we know to be the most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity. And the great indicator of that, of course, is language loss. When all of us were born, there were 7,000 languages spoken on Earth. Now, a language isn't just a body of vocabulary or a set of grammatical phrases. A language is a flash of the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of each particular culture comes into the material realm. Every language, I wrote in that book, is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and spiritual possibilities. And of those 7,000 languages spoken the day that you were born, by all linguistic consensus, fully half aren't being whispered into the ears of infants, which means they're on the road to extinction. And what that means is that unless something changes, within a single generation, we will be losing fully half of humanity's social, ecological, and spiritual knowledge. And again, this does not have to happen. Now, there are many people who say, well, wait a minute, wouldn't the world be a better place if we all spoke one language? Wouldn't communication be facilitated? And of course, my answer to that is what a great idea. But let's make that universal language Nuptatak. Let's make it Yoruba. Let's make it Mandarin. Let's make it Lakota. And you suddenly begin to feel, as a native speaker of English, what it would be like to be enveloped in silence, to have no means or ability to pass on the wisdom of your ancestry, or to anticipate the promise of your descendants. And yet that dreadful plight is indeed the fate of somebody on earth every fortnight, because on average, every 2 weeks, some elder passes away and carries with him or her into the grave the last syllables of an ancient tongue. And the reason this is so poignant in this time in history is precisely because it is occurring in the same generation in which geneticists have proven it to be true, what philosophers have always dreamt to be true, and that is that we are all really brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean quite literally, studies of the human genome have left no doubt whatsoever that the genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. Race is an utter fiction. We are all cut from the same genetic cloth. Indeed, we are all children of Africa. We are all descendants of a handful of people who walked out of the ancient continent some 65,000 years ago and then embarked on this extraordinary hijra, a diaspora 40,000 years in duration, 2,500 human generations that carried the human spirit to every corner of the habitable world. But here's the important point. If we are, as we indeed are, cut from the same genetic cloth, it means by definition that every culture shares the same fundamental human potential, the same mental acuity, the same raw human genius. And whether that genius is placed into technological wizardry, which has been the great achievement in the West, or by contrast, invested in the complex task of unraveling the threads of memory inherent in a myth, is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no ladder of progress in the affairs of culture. That old 19th century idea that we somehow went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized at the Strand of London has been absolutely debunked by modern science, both genetics and anthropology, and shown to be but an artifact of the 19th century, as relevant to our lives today as the notion that clergymen had in that era that the earth was only 6,000 years old. In this sort of stunning affirmation of the human spirit, we have affirmed the essential interconnectedness of humanity. And what that means fundamentally is that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you. They're not failed attempts at being modern. Every culture, by definition, is a unique answer to that basic question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the myriad of peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in the 7,000 different languages of humanity. And those answers collectively become our human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us as a species in the coming millennia. But the challenge becomes, what do we do about it, even as activists, let alone as scholars? I mean, if you're a biologist and you identify an area of high species endemism, you can create a protected area, but you can't make a rainforest park of the mind. You can't freeze culture in time. Cultures aren't museum pieces. They're ever-changing, ever-evolving social organisms. And so when I was recruited to the National Geographic with the very bold mission of changing the way the world viewed and valued culture in a decade, we really had to think about what we could do. A number of academics suggested conferences, databases, and our eyes just glazed. And suddenly I realized one day that we were sitting in the heart of the greatest storytelling institution in the world. And whereas polemics are never persuasive, and politicians follow but never lead, storytellers, in fact, change the world. So I decided to set out on a series of journeys into the ethnosphere, if you would, to take our enormous audience of literally hundreds of millions of people every month around the world to points in the ethnosphere where the beliefs and practices were so inherently dazzling that you couldn't help but come away with a new appreciation as to the wonder of culture. So, for example, at one point I decided to make a film on the Buddhist science of the mind. Well, why, you might ask, would you use that phrase to describe what you think to be a religion? Well, what is science but the empirical pursuit of the truth? What is Tibetan Buddhism but 2,500 years of direct empirical observation as to the nature of mind? A Lama once said to me that Western science is too often a major response to minor needs. He said, you spend all of your lifetime in the West trying to live to be 100 without losing your teeth. We in Tibet, he said, spend all of our lifetimes trying to understand the nature of mind, the nature of existence. He said, your billboards celebrate naked teenagers in underwear. Our billboards are money walls of prayers for the well-being of all sentient creatures. So let me take you this evening to a few of these places that I went over the last 20 years, and let's begin with the greatest culture sphere ever brought into being by the human imagination, and that, of course, is Polynesia. Tens of thousands of islands flung like jewels upon a southern sea. And I was very fortunate to be invited some years ago to sail with the Wayfinders of the Polynesian Voyaging Society on the Hokulea, the sacred canoe of Hawaii, named after the star of Hawaii and modeled on the drawings of the great catamarans that James Cook and Joseph Banks encountered in their journeys through the South Pacific in the 18th century. And even today, the young sailors of Hawaii can name 350 stars in the night sky. They can sense the presence of distant atolls of islands beyond the visible horizon simply by watching the reverberation of waves across the hull of the vessel, knowing full well that every island group in the Pacific has its own unique refractive pattern that can be read with the same perspicacity with which a forensic scientist would read a fingerprint. These are sailors who, in the darkness of the hull of the vessel, can distinguish as many as 5 different sea swells moving through the sacred canoe at any one point in time, distinguishing those caused by local weather disturbances from the deep currents that pulsate across the ocean and can be followed with the same ease with which a terrestrial explorer would follow a river to the sea. Indeed, if you took all of the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applied it to an understanding of the ocean, what you would get is Polynesia. But the most amazing thing about this tradition was that it was all based on dead reckoning. Now, dead reckoning means that you only know where you are by remembering precisely how you got there. Now, it was the impossibility of using dead reckoning on a long oceanic voyage that kept most European transports hugging the shores of continents until the British solved the problem of longitude with the invention of the chronometer. But we know for a scientific fact that 10 centuries before Christ, from an ancient civilization that we call Lapita, off the coast of New Guinea, New Caledonia, the ancestors of the Polynesians set sail into the rising sun. In 1,000 years, they reached Samoa and Tonga, and then the movement halted for 10 centuries. Then it began again, 4,000 kilometers across the central Pacific to the Marquesas, northwest to Hawaii, southeast to Rapa Nui or Easter Island, and eventually around the time of the First Crusades, reaching what we now call New Zealand. And what that meant is that on those multi-week oceanic voyages, the wayfinder had to sit monk-like on the stern of the vessel, rarely eating, never sleeping, and remembering every shift of wind, every sign of the stars, the moon, the sky, the ocean. And if he lost that train of continuity, the voyage would perish. And yet this knowledge was the way that Pacific Ocean was settled by these extraordinary wayfinders, the greatest navigators in the history of the human imagination. Now, if we go from the greatest ocean sphere, we enter the greatest forest. We enter the homeland of the people of the Anaconda, the forests of the Northwest Amazon. Joseph Conrad said that the rainforest was less a forest than a primeval mob, a remnant of an ancient era when vegetation rioted and consumed the world. And in the Amazon, we of course find the greatest source of biodiversity on Earth, but everything in the Amazon invites hyperbole, even as it defies the imagination. The river itself, the greatest source of water on Earth, a river that doesn't flow to the sea, it's pushed to the sea by the runoff of the Andean Cordillera. If you put the Washington Monument at the mouth of the Amazon, its spire would be taller than any building in Manaus or Iquitos, cities 2,400 miles upstream. If you took all the water that flows out of the Amazon in 24 hours, you'd have as much as flows out of the River Thames in a year. In fact, if you could drain Lake Ontario and redirect the Amazon to its shores, and no doubt the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has such a plan, Lake Ontario would refill not in years or months or even days, but in 3 hours with the water that flows out of the Amazon. And because of its immensity, it's provoked conjectures that have not always been accurate. In fact, in a fascinating way, everything that I was taught about the Amazon in the 1970s has been proven to be wrong. You know, we learned originally that this forest was a fragile place that could endure our ways for only so long, and this came from an early book by a man called Paul Richards, who tried to simply distinguish tropical from temperate forests. And it is true that in a temperate forest with the periodicity of the seasons, the accumulation of rich organic leaf litter, the biological wealth of the forest is in the soil. And in the tropics, by contrast, it is true that high rates of humidity, and temperature lead to rapid rates of decomposition, such that the living vegetation, in a sense, becomes the capital of the ecosystem. Now, that idea, while useful as a way of distinguishing in broad strokes these two fundamentally different types of forest, when applied to a land area 7 times the size of Ontario, becomes as much cliche or slogan as it is science. We now know, after 50 years of field research, that there are areas in the Amazon, in the upland forests of the Amazon, that collectively are the size of France, of rich black soils, clearly of human origins. We also know, and should have known by a cursory glimpse at the journals of Aureliana, who sailed down the Amazon in 1541, that the Amazon, before Columbus, was not an empty place, but homeland to tens of millions of Indian peoples. Now, that idea of the Amazon as a fragile place held for a number of reasons. First, it fit our environmental agenda and our concerns for a forest that was being rapidly transformed, particularly by the agricultural frontier of Brazil moving up from the south. But more importantly, it fit our notion of what it meant to live in the Amazon, because by the time anthropologists in number got into the basin, the main populations had been extinguished for 400 years. Remember that term decimate in Latin means to kill 1 in 10. Amerindian peoples were never decimated. Quite to the contrary, 90% were killed from European diseases, from Tierra del Fuego to the high Arctic, within a generation or two of contact. So the Amazon became an empty place, but it most assuredly was not an empty space. Secondly, by the time anthropologists got into the Amazon, remember that the most wild areas of it were actually, curiously enough, in the margins of the basin, protected by geography from the east and by the Andean Cordillera from the west, which was not penetrated by roads until the 1940s. So anthropologists were drawn to the real Indians. These were these small populations, often living in isolation and open conflict with their neighbors, and living very close to major metropolitan centers. And that almost fragile, or the perception of fragility, what Betty Meggers famously termed a counterfeit paradise, became the cliche and the lens through which we interpreted Amerindian life. But the real question became, is there not any place in the Amazon where the echoes of these ancient civilizations, now being revealed by archaeology, could still be heard? Well, the answer is that there is. In the homeland of the people of the Anaconda, in the northwest Amazon of Colombia, the Barasana, the Tanimucos, the Tucanos, a whole complex of indigenous people. Now, the standard kind of idea of the Amazon Indian is exemplified by the Guarani, a people I lived with in the late 1970s, a people first peacefully contacted in 1958. In 1956, 5 missionaries attempted contact and made a critical mistake. They dropped from the air 8 by 10 glossy photographs of themselves in what we would say were friendly gestures, forgetting that the Indians of the rainforest had never seen anything two-dimensional in their lives. So they picked up the photographs from the forest floor, looked behind the face to try to find the form to the figure, found nothing, and concluded, not inaccurately, that these were calling cards from the devil, and they promptly speared the 5 missionaries to death. But the Guarani didn't just spear outsiders. We traced genealogies back 8 generations and found that the males had a 54% mortality rate due to them spearing each other. In fact, we found 2 cases of natural death, and when we pressured the people a little bit about it, they admitted that the men had gotten so old that they died getting old, so they speared them anyway. But the Guarani had a knowledge of the forest that was astonishing. Their hunters could smell animal urine at 40 paces and tell you what form of life had left that urine behind, not because they were sauvage in a kind of Rousseauian sense, but because they were true natural philosophers who had paid close attention to a forest homeland upon which their lives depended. And this knowledge of the botanical realm is, of course, what drew us to the Amazon as botanical explorers. Now, I was exceedingly lucky to attend Harvard College and fall into the orbit of the legendary Amazon explorer, Richard Evans Schultes. I always stress to all students that life is not linear, it's serendipitous, and what you must do is become an opportunist and put yourself in the way of opportunities, and then be prepared to leap off cliffs. And the great revelation of all the sages of all time is that when you leap off the cliff, you actually end up landing on a feather bed because the world looks after you. And so I ended up going to Harvard on a whim because I won't even tell you why. But I got there, and you had to decide what to major in, and the deadline was the next day. And I happened to have walked through the Museum of Ethnology for the first time, and with my imagination still swirling with these dioramas of these shamans dressed in all the colors of the rainbow, I ran into an acquaintance on the streets of Cambridge, and I said, "Stuart, what are you signing on for in the morning?" And he said, "Anthropology." And I said, "What's that?" "Well, you read about Indians." And like Forrest Gump, I said, "That'll do." And I signed on as a student of anthropology, and then after 2 years of only reading about indigenous people, I wanted to live with indigenous people, and I was in a cafe in Harvard Square. Anyway, there's a National Geographic map of the world, and David looked at the map, and he looked at me, and he looked at the map, and he looked at me, and he suddenly pointed to the high Arctic. Well, I had to go somewhere, and I watched my left arm lift, and it hit the Amazon. Now, if it had hit Italy, I might have become a Renaissance scholar. But having decided to go to the Amazon, within 2 weeks, David was in Rankin Inlet, living with the Inuit. There was only one man to see, this legendary plant explorer who shot blowguns in class and kept outside his door a bucket of peyote buttons available to his students as an optional laboratory experiment. Schultes, having solved the mystery of Olawiki, the serpent vine, and having collected the first specimens of Tewanakatl, the flesh of the gods, the so-called magic mushrooms, he had slipped away to the northwest Amazon in 1941, where he remained for 12 uninterrupted years, traveling down unknown rivers, living amongst unknown peoples, all the time enchanted by the wonder of the neotropical rainforest. In time, mountains would bear his name, as would national parks. But he was an odd choice to become a 60s icon, because it was true that he had sparked the psychedelic era, but his politics were wildly conservative. He didn't vote for the Republican Party. He professed not to believe in the American Revolution. He always voted for Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. He was such an Anglophile that one of his colleagues said the only way for Schultes to go native would be to go to London. So at the age of 18, I knocked on his fourth floor eyrie at the Botanical Museum, and I got as far as saying, "Sir, I'm from British." That's all it took. That adjective. "I'm from British Columbia. I've saved up money in a logging camp, and I want to go to the Amazon like you did and collect plants." At the time, I had never taken a biology class in my life. I mean, not in high school or anything. And I knew nothing about the Amazon. And instead of asking me for my credentials, the man that Prince Philip had called the father of the Amazon peered across a mound of specimens through his antiquated bifocals and just said very simply, "Well, son, when do you want to go?" And 2 weeks later, I was in the Amazon, where I would stay for 15 months. And just before leaving, he said, "Always remember that the difference between a poison, a narcotic, a medicine, and a hallucinogen is just dosage." And so the whole thing is we were supposed to keep our eyes out for biodynamic plants, which of course can be manipulated for modern science. And an example of that, of course, is the flying death, curare, derived from as many as 90 different species across the botanical spectrum, many of which have D-tubocurarin in them, this profound muscle relaxant used to kill game, but also a drug that revolutionized modern surgery in the 1940s. And this invariably led us into the realm of the shaman. And if you follow the pioneering ethnographic work of someone like Shirley MacLaine, you would think that a shaman is a benign figure with feathers and bells who sings a lot. I've been without a lot of shaman, and I've never been with one who wasn't a little psychotic. That's their job. They're the ones who swim in the mystic waters most people would drown in. They're the ones who go into these metaphysical realms that most human beings want to avoid, as we simply want to raise our children. And the key to the shamanic art of healing is to recognize that disease is defined not as the presence of pathogens, but as a state of imbalance that must be addressed in a metaphysical sense. And therefore the essential act of healing is a magical act. And that accounts for one of the most a magical act, incidentally, in which the shaman must invoke some technique of ecstasy to soar away on the wings of trance to get into the very metaphysical realms where he or she can work their deeds of rescue. And that, curiously, accounts for one of the most remarkable anomalies in botanical science, and that is the fact that of the 120 known hallucinogenic plants, fully 95% are from the Americas and Siberia, not because the forests of equatorial West Africa or Southeast Asia were depauperate, but rather because people there had other avenues to the divine. But in the Americas, the route to the Godhead was mediated by these plants that so fascinated Schultes for all of his career. Here, for example, a photograph that he took in 1956 with Kodachrome of Yanomami Indians using a preparation that he was the first to document, ebene, the semen of the sun. The red powders derived from the resin of several species in the genus Virola in the nutmeg family, blown up the nose. These powders are full of tryptamines, very close to brain serotonin. Dimethyltryptamine, 5-methoxy-dimethyltryptamine. To have this stuff shot up your nose is rather like being shot out of a rifle barrel lined with Baroque paintings and landing on a sea of electricity. It creates not the distortion of reality, it creates the elimination of reality. In fact, I used to argue with Schultes that you couldn't classify this as a hallucinogen because by the time you're under the influence, there was no one home anymore to experience the hallucinations. But what interests us about these plants is not just their dazzling pharmacological effects, but what they tell us about a different way of knowing. Now, those snuffs are blown up the nose for a very specific reason. Tryptamines cannot be taken orally because they're denatured by an enzyme found in the human gut called monoamine oxidase. They can only be taken orally if taken in conjunction with some other drug that denatures the MAO in the human gut and therefore potentiates the tryptamines. Now, the iconic shamanic preparation, of course, is ayahuasca, the vision vine, the vine of the soul. But ayahuasca, used throughout the northwest Amazon, is not a plant, it's a combination of plants. On the one hand, the leaves of a nondescript shrub in the coffee family, Psychotria viridis, full of these tryptamines, and secondly, the bark of a woody liana in a completely different family of plants, which contains in it beta-carbolines, harmine and harmaline, which are MAO inhibitors of the precise sort necessary to potentiate the tryptamines in the leaves. Now, here's the interesting question. How, in a flora of 80,000 species of vascular plants, did the indigenous people learn to combine these completely distinct, morphologically distinct denizens of the rainforest to create this powerful synergistic effect? The only scientific explanation is trial and error, which is quickly statistically exposed as a meaningless euphemism. If you ask the Indian people, they say the plants teach us. Well, what does that mean? When Schultes lived with the Siona sequoia in the 1940s, he recorded 17 varieties of the woody liana, all of which were referable to his Harvard-trained taxonomic eye as being the same species. When he asked them the nature of their classification, they looked at him as if he were a fool, because any proper botanist would know that you took each one of the 17 varieties on the night of a full moon, and each variety sang to you in a different key. Now, that's not going to get you a PhD in plant systematics at UBC, but it's a lot more interesting than counting stamens. But it speaks about another way of knowing. Now, speaking of other ways of knowing, remember earlier I said we now think we can hear the echo of these ancient civilizations in the homeland of the people of the Anaconda. How do we know that? Well, they live in architectural longhouses, malokas, that in their symbolic resonance rival anything the Inca or the Maya ever built. They have complex processes of initiation which honor the acquisition of wisdom and knowledge as opposed to combat and murder. We know that they have social structures that facilitate peace and trade and exchange, not the least of which is a marriage rule that you must marry someone who speaks a different language. And so in any one longhouse you have 6 and 7 languages spoken, but you never hear a child practicing a distinct tongue. They simply wait, listen, and one day begin to speak. The Maloka is a model of the universe, but hovering over the universe is a divine Maloka, which is anchored in the sacred places where the ancestors still live today. And these ancestors are remembered in these remarkable ritual events like this celebration of fertility and cassava woman that we filmed in 2009. This was the most extraordinary experience. In the 1970s, it seemed like these societies were about to slip away. Stephen Hugh Jones, head of anthropology at Cambridge, has studied the Badasanas since 1967. And in the early 70s, he was quoted in a BBC strand of films called Disappearing Worlds that the Badasana were not long for this world. And halfway through this ritual event, Stephen flew in from London to join us. And he couldn't believe his eyes. He saw this longhouse full of 250 Badasana men in full ritual regalia taking ayahuasca for 3 days and 3 nights in this incredible celebration. He got on the phone to his wife back in London and said, "Christine, you won't believe my eyes. The only thing that disappeared were the fucking missionaries." And what in fact had happened, and this is important, these cultures are not on a one-way street downward. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but what in fact happened is that a Colombian president, Virgilio Barco, had said to a colleague of ours, Martin van Hildebrand, do something for the Indians. And in 5 incredible years as head of Indian Affairs, Martin did more than something. He secured legal land tenure rights encoded in the 1991 Constitution of Colombia for an area of land collectively the size of the United Kingdom for 57 ethnicities of the Northwest Amazon. And behind a veil of isolation created by the troubles of modern Colombia, with the federal state having little presence in that area of forest the size of France, a new dream of culture was born. And when we asked the elders, why did you allow the missionaries to do this to you? They said, because they promised to make us somebody, promised us to make us human. And of course, the essence of colonization is to persuade the colonized of their own inherent inferiority. It's like what Justice Sinclair said about the coast of British Columbia. There are only 3 questions in life: who am I, where do I come from, and where am I going? And when the colonizers came, they said to all indigenous people that all of your answers for all time for those 3 questions have been wrong. And yet now, in the Northwest Amazon, there's this extraordinary rebirth. And what happens during these rituals is that the individuals in ingesting ayahuasca actually become the ancestors and travel through space and time to the points of origin to reaffirm humanity's obligations to the earth in this great dance of reciprocity. And what we've now come to understand is that these cosmologies and mythologies, when deconstructed, amount to nothing more or less than complex, sophisticated land management plans that dictate precisely how people in great concentrations can live in the upland forests of the Amazon. And one of my most surreal experiences, having taken ayahuasca for 3 days and 3 nights, and I was still painted in all the black chinapa dye that you must wear when I flew back to Obama's first inauguration. And my wife picked me up at the airport with my black tie, and I went that night to an inauguration ball, and went to the inauguration the next morning, and then walked across to the airport, because everything was shut down, to get on a private jet trip for the National Geographic and travel in 23 days around the world. So the juxtaposition was kind of extraordinary. At any rate, now let's take us from the lowland forest to the Andes. And one of the things Schulte said to me before I left his office was that I had to look up his man in Colombia, his protege, a young botanist by the name of Timothy Plowman. And for Timothy, Schultes had done the impossible. He had secured the dream academic grant of the 1970s, $250,000 and a brand new Dodge fire engine red pickup truck to study a plant known to the Inca as the divine leaf of immortality. And this, of course, was coca, the notorious source of cocaine. And it was an extraordinary assignment because the efforts to eradicate the traditional fields had been underway for over 50 years, long before there was any problem with illicit cocaine hydrochloride. And we knew that in the time of the Inca, the plant was revered as no other. Unable to cultivate it at the elevation of the imperial capital of Cusco, they replicated it in gold and silver leaf in fields that colored the horizon. And to this day, no event occurs of significance in the Andes of South America that is not mediated by an exchange of the energy of this leaf with the sacred deities, the mountain deities, the Apu deities that dominate the lives of the living. And to the surprise and horror of our backers at the U.S. government, we did the first nutritional study of coca, and what we found was that, yes, there was a small amount of cocaine hydrochloride, roughly analogous to the amount of caffeine in a coffee bean, and nobody noticed the irony that at every drug abuse conference, all the narcs bolted for the coffee pot at 10 o'clock in the morning. But in addition to the small amount of alkaloid absorbed benignly through the mucous membrane of the mouth, coca was chock full of vitamins. It had more calcium in it than any plant ever studied by science, which made it perfect for a diet that lacked dairy product, particularly for young women. It also had enzymes in it which enhanced the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, which made it perfect for the potato diet of the Andes. And so in one scientific assay, we put into stark profile these terrible efforts that are underway to this day to eliminate the traditional fields, and we showed that this was a plant that had been used with no evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, for over 4,000 years in South America. And so with coca as my lens, both metaphorically and literally, the rhythms of the Andes came into focus. And I became very interested in this notion of reciprocity and this notion of sacred geography. And I don't mean that in the spirit, again, of hippie ethnography, but what does it actually mean for a people to believe that the earth is alive, that the earth owes its abundance to humanity, but humanity has reciprocal obligations to the earth? Now that is not a trivial thing. You know, we in the West, as Saul Bellow said, science made a house cleaning of belief, and all notions of myth, magic, and mysticism were swept under the carpet of history during the Enlightenment. And so when we look at a mountain, we see a pile of rock, but when my godson looks at it, he sees an Apu deity that will direct his destiny. I was raised in the forests of British Columbia to believe that those forests existed to be cut. That was the foundation of the ideology of scientific forestry that I learned at UBC, and I practiced in the woods as a logger for Macmillan Blodell. That made me very different from my friends up and down the coast of British Columbia, people like the Kwakwaka'wak, who believed that those forests were the abode of Hukluk and the crooked peak of heaven, and the cannibal spirits that had to be embraced in Muhammad's initiation, such that the wisdom of the wild would come back to the community in the potlatch. Now, the interesting thing is not to say who's right and who's wrong. Is that forest cellulose and board feet? Is it the domain of the spirits? The interesting thing is, on a metaphorical level, how the belief systems mediate the interaction between the particular culture and the natural world with profoundly different consequences in terms of ecological footprint. I was raised to believe that a mountain was a pile of rock ready to be mined. My godson, was raised to believe that the mountain was a deity that would direct his destiny. And that belief is affirmed by these fantastic ritual events, one of which is known as the Mojimiento. And he lives in a wonderful village called Chinchero, which was the site of the summer palace of Topa Incupanqui, the second of the great Incan rulers. There are only three. The Incan Empire never lasted more than 100 years, and in that time they built 14,000 miles of road. But once each year in Chinchero, the fastest young boy is given the honor of becoming a transvestite. And for one day, he puts on the clothing of his sister or his mother, and he has to lead all able-bodied men on a run. But it's not your ordinary run. You start off at 11,500 feet, run 2,000 feet down to the base of the sacred mountain, and then run to 16,000 feet, only to fall away to the sacred valley and cross two more soaring Andean ridges over the course of a 24-hour event. The entire perimeter of the run is marked by holy mounds of earth, where the Walaka must spin to bring the vortex of the feminine to the mountaintop, where coca is given to Pachamama, libations of alcohol to the wind. And the whole idea is that you go into the day as an individual, but through exhaustion and sacrifice in Latin means to make sacred, you emerge from the day as a single community, a single communal pulse that is once again, in gesture and ritual and prayer, reaffirmed your place on the planet. Now, at the age of 48, I became the only outsider ever to participate and complete the movimiento, and also the oldest man ever to attempt it. And I can assure you, I only got through that day by chewing more coca leaves in one day than anyone in the 4,000-year history of the planet. But what really got me through is I baptized over the years so many godchildren, and when they heard that their padrino was stupid enough to run the movimiento at the age of 48, they clung to me like a limpet. They weren't going to let anything happen to their cash cow. But these localized rituals become marvelously pan-Andean in these great events like the Coyariti, when the Pleiades re-emerge in the heavens and tens of thousands of people from all over the southern Andes converge on the Sinicara Valley, dominated by the three tongues of a sacred glacier. And it's a perfect expression of the syncretic reality of Andean Peru. 500 years of Catholic faith on the back of hundreds of generations of pre-Columbian intuitions. Whenever my friends in the southern Andes are approached by an anthropologist who tries to dissect from their experience what is Catholic and what is pre-Columbian, as my friends say, it only gives us a headache, because it's a complete fusion of both worlds, and it's within that one finds beauty. So the symbols of the ritual are largely Christian. You carry the crosses from your community on pilgrimage, on your back, to the ice fields, but always in the shadow of Ausangati, the most sacred of the mountains of the Inca. The crosses are then placed in the ice for 72 hours, and then recharged and renewed by Pachamama, they're carried down to the community. Now, if this is an expression of the kind of syncretic reality of the Andes, there's one place in South America where the pre-Columbian voice can be heard unfettered, and that is in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, a volcanic massif that soars to 20,000 feet from the Caribbean coastal plain of Colombia. Descendants of the ancient Tairona civilization, the Arhuacos, the Kogi, the Wiwa, retreated in this massif in the wake of the conquest, and in the blood-stained continent they've never been vanquished by the Spanish. They're still ruled by a ritual priesthood, but the training for the priesthood is rather austere. According to Reichel Domatov, who brought back a report in the 1940s, the acolytes are taken away from their families at the age of 3, sequestered in a shadowy world of darkness for 18 years, during which they never see the natural world, all the time enculturating the values of their society, which maintain the idea that their prayers alone maintain the cosmic balance of the earth. Then after this incredible initiation, they're taken out at the age of 18 and taken on a journey through the mountains to the heart of the world, where suddenly the beauty of the world is seen in all of its clarity, and everything they've learned is affirmed. Now that story was almost a fable in anthropology, because no anthropologist had ever actually witnessed this incredible initiation. And then an amazing thing happened. This man walked into my office at the National Geographic, Danilo Villafana, with 3 mamos or priests from the Sierra Nevada. And as he was chatting to me with the Colombian ambassador at his side, Carolina Barco, I couldn't help but say, Danilo, I don't mean to be rude, but you look like an old friend of mine. And I showed him this photograph I had taken in 1974, and the man on your right, as you can see, is Danilo's father, Adalberto, and this young cousin, Eugenio, is now this revered elder, second from the left in this photograph that I took. And I said, Danilo, you may not remember, but when you were a baby, I carried you on my back up and down the mountains with your father. And his father had been murdered by the paramilitaries. So this connection was so kind of moving for all of us that he suddenly invited us to go back to actually film a journey to the heart of the world. And what we discovered is that at least today, the young acolytes don't spend 18 years in the darkness, but they do spend 18 years isolated in the environs of the men's sacred circle, much of the time at night in the sacred temple, learning the Baroque elements of this complex religious worldview, and then they really are taken on a journey to the heart of the world, to Saranqua, the peaks at the summit of the heavens. Every ripple in the landscape resonates with mythological significance. Even the sisal hats they weave are an attempt to echo the snowfields and the flanks of the holy mountain. And we got to the penultimate stop on this pilgrimage, a pilgrimage that begins at the sea, goes to the ice, and then goes from the ice back to the sea, when suddenly we saw the priests in a circle. The metaphor in this culture is the threads of life. When you move up and down a mountain, your movements are described as threads, which over the course of a lifetime you weave a cloak over the body of Saranqua. When they pray, they move their fingers as if their thoughts and prayers are threads. And we saw this circle of mamos praying, and we realized that we had a problem because the FARC had come through that hamlet not an hour before we arrived, looking for us to kidnap us, and because our agenda was quite public, and we fortunately had been delayed for an hour. So we had to abandon our kit, hide out until dark. You don't really have a dramatic escape on a mule. You kind of clip-clop your way to rescue. But we did escape up these cracks in the rock, ran into a firefight with the 1st Colombian Battalion in the morning, and we're lucky to get away. But the fortunate thing is that we had trained the Arahuacos in cinematography, so they actually finished this segment of the film for us as we returned, as part of this collaborative effort, to the from this point where you can see the Arahuaco sentinels watching for the FARC in the dark as the night comes on. And then we just retreated to the coast where, even though these sacred places are surrounded by and built up with these skyscrapers, it doesn't stop the elder brothers from doing what they always do, the ritual gestures and the prayers upon which they believe the balance of the earth depends. It is humbling to think that not 2 hours from Miami Beach, this pre-Columbian civilization is every day actively praying for our well-being. They dismiss us as the younger brothers who have ruined the world. Now, I've always lived by the adage that if it works, it's obsolete. And after 4 years in South America as an ethnobotanist, I was looking for something new, and there was always something awaiting you in the 4th floor office of Professor Schultes. And one miserable winter day in 1982, he summoned me to his office and asked me casually whether I was interested in going down to the Caribbean island nation of Haiti, infiltrating the secret societies, and securing the formula of a drug used to make zombies. Well, naturally, I said yes, thinking that it would consume a couple of weeks of my life. In the end, it would consume 4 years of my life, because within 24 hours of arriving in Haiti, something was made available to me that had eluded me all that time in South America, and that was a window truly wide open to the mystic. You know, it's interesting, were I to ask you to name the great religions of the world, what do you say? Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, whatever. What continent's always left out? Sub-Saharan Africa, the tacit assumption being that African people south of the Sahara had no religious beliefs. Well, of course they did. And voodoo is not a black magic cult. Voodoo is simply a fond word from Dahomey that means spirit or God. And in many ways, voodoo is a quintessentially democratic faith because a believer has direct access to the divine. The essence of voodoo, as is the case with most religions, is a relationship between the living and the dead, such that the living give birth to the dead become part of the ancestral pool of energy. Out of that pool of energy emerge the archetypes, which are the spirits of the pantheon. But in this quintessentially democratic faith, even the dead must be made to serve the living. To serve the living, they must become manifest. To become manifest, they must respond to the summons of the drum. To come back from beneath the world of the invisibles, to momentarily displace the soul of the living, so that for that brief shining moment, human and spirit become one and the same. And that's why Haitians say that white people go to church and speak about God, we dance in the temple and become God. And indeed, Haitians, through this vehicle of spirit possession, move in and out of their spirit realm with an ease and impunity that is astonishing to the ethnographic observer. And it's precisely because of this notion that the human being is the god that you see these theatrical gestures. Here in Benin, an acolyte in trance slicing into his skin, or more profoundly in Haiti, voodoo acolytes in a state of trance handling burning embers with impunity, a rather astonishing example of the mind's ability to affect the body that bears it when catalyzed in a state of extreme excitation. So voodoo is not a black magic cult, it is a complex metaphysical worldview. I wrote a book about my experiences in Haiti that was made into the worst Hollywood movie in history. Hemingway said that if you sell a book to Hollywood, you should start off in Arizona, drive to the California state line, throw the book over, and go back to Tucson and have a drink. I didn't do that. As you'll see, I slipped away to the forests of Borneo. But we have this idea that these cultures, quaint and colorful though they may be, are somehow destined to fade away as if by natural law, as if they're failed attempts at being modern, failed attempts at keeping up. Nothing could be further from the truth. In every case, these are dynamic, living peoples being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. Technology is no threat to culture. Change is no threat to culture. What is a threat to culture is power. And the observation that, in fact, these cultures aren't fading away but being driven out of existence is actually an optimistic one, because it suggests that if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we can be the facilitators of cultural survival. And I went to the forests of Borneo because I wanted to live in a place wet with the innocence of birth. I wanted to live with nomads because we were all once nomads, wanderers on a pristine planet. It was only the Neolithic Revolution 12,000 years ago where the seed displaced we succumbed, as Joseph Campbell said, to the cult of the seed, and the shaman's poetry became the prose of the priesthood. In nomadic societies like that of the Penan of Sarawak, how do you measure wealth, if you think about it, when there's absolutely no incentive to accumulate anything? And in fact, there's a disincentive. Well, for the Penan, wealth is explicitly conceived to be the strength of social relations between people. Because if those relations fray, everybody suffers. Sharing is automatic. There is no word for thank you in Penan because everything is automatically shared because you never know who will be the next to bring food to the encampment. I once gave a cigarette to a Penan woman and watched as she tore it apart to distribute the individual strands of tobacco to each hut in the encampment, rendering the product useless but honoring her social obligation to share. And by the same token, in these non-literate traditions, remember, writing was a great advance, but writing by definition is a tool designed to dull memory. In these oral traditions, memory is acute, and the entire knowledge of the community is encoded in the vocabulary of the best storyteller. And by the same token, there's a dialogue with the natural world, such that the flight of a hornbill becomes a cursive script of nature, like a vocabulary written on the wind. But by the time I got there in the late 80s, with my good friend Ian McKenzie, the linguist, the sounds of the forest had become the sounds of machinery. We talked so much about the demise of the Amazon in the 1980s and 90s, but at a time when Brazil produced 1.3% of the tropical log exports of the world, Malaysia produced 45%, much of it from the homeland of the Penan. And so within a single generation, the rivers that once ran clear became so laden with silt that it seemed as if all of Borneo was slipping away to the South China Sea, where the Japanese freighters hung light on the horizon. Women reduced to servitude and prostitution, children suffering from diseases unknown in the forest, men, of course, humiliated, ultimately standing up, blowpipes against bulldozers, no match for the power of the Malaysian state, a quixotic action that electrified the global environmental community, but in the end did not help the Penan. And in a single generation, their way of life, morally inspired, inherently right, was torn apart and crushed like a forest that had given it birth. And these egregious industrial intrusions don't just occur in distant realms. This is my closest friend here in British Columbia, the Tahltan leader, Oscar Dennis. This photograph, incidentally, appeared in the National Geographic magazine, and women from all around the world made a beeline for Iskut, British Columbia. Oz would call me up and say, "Wait, there's this chick from Poland coming to see me." I'd say, "So, man, Oz, brother, it's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You just had someone from Moscow there last week." "I know. We don't speak Russian or Polish." He said, "They don't really come for conversation." But, I showed this photograph, just as an aside, to Premier Campbell, and I asked him a single question. I said, in the 5 years before this photograph was taken, Barrick Gold from an environmentally exemplary mine at Eskay Creek took 400 tons of gold and 5,000 tons of silver, a valuation of $25 billion out of Tahltan land. And I said, "Mr. Premier, in the 10 years they operated, the infrastructure of Oscar's village did not improve or change one bit. And in those years, Oscar's brother hung himself in the basement of his mother's house. Another brother died of medical malpractice in Prince Rupert. A third brother drowned 15 feet from shore. A sister died on the streets of Prince George from drugs and prostitution. And Oz's only daughter blew her head off playing Russian roulette with a handgun. We now know it was a drug hit." And I said, in that time, nothing changed in their community, and I'd like to know why there's not a hockey rink in Iskut. And I'd like to know why there's not a swimming pool in Iskut. And I'd like to know why there are not trust funds in Iskut so that Oscar's kids can go to UBC like my kids can go to UBC, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not just about the industrial intrusion of these, it's also about social justice. And Oscar and the Tahltan have been standing up for the sacred headwaters, this remarkable valley where the Stikine, Nass, and Skeena are all born in remarkably close proximity to each other. And I don't want to dwell on this tonight, except to say one of the ways of thinking about this is so curious. And what does it take to get a mine established in Canada? Well, you cobble together a company, perhaps with less history than my dog. You secure the rights to a place you've never been online, a place you've never experienced the harshness of a bitter winter or the promise of a bright spring. And as long as you can guarantee the government a flow of revenue, either in the form of royalties or taxation, you, by definition, secure the right to transform that place forever. Now, that's not an environmental rant or a polemic, it's just how it works. But what I find interesting is that there's very little attempt in the calculus that rationalizes the industrialization of the wild that attempts to place any monetary value on the land as it was, or any cost to the commons, the rest of us who aren't working for the mine, who aren't invested in the mine, the cost to us implicit in the permanent transformation of that valley. These are seen to be externalities when in fact they lie at the very heart of the issue, certainly as Indigenous people would see them to be. And this touches upon the idea that we have this cult of the modern, the cult of modernity, as if modernity exists outside of time and culture, when in fact, by definition, is a product of both. And this world that we call the modern is simply the expression of our particular way of doing things, which has its benefits and its assets, but is not some kind of universal, inexorable wave of history. Now, to put that in perspective, let's go to a civilization far older than ours, which has a very different way of thinking about landscape, and this brings us to the outback of Australia. When the British first arrived in Australia, they saw people that looked strange, who had simple material technology. But what deeply offended the British about the Aboriginal people of Australia is that they had no interest whatsoever in improving upon their lot. Now, progress, improvement, optimism, change were the very ethos of Europe at the time. Ideas that incidentally died in the mud and blood of Flanders of the Great War. But when the English looked at these people, what really offended them is that they didn't have those values. And so in their inimitable way, they concluded that the Aboriginal people of Australia, who we know from studies of the Y chromosome were the first humans to walk out of Africa, were not human beings at all. And as recently as 1902, it was debated in Parliament in Melbourne as to whether Aboriginal people were human or not. As recently as the 1950s, ranchers had quotas as to how many abos they could shoot with impunity on their land. As recently as 1960, a school book, A Treasury of Fauna of Australia, listed the Aboriginal people as amongst the interesting forms of wildlife on the continent. And what was missing was the failure of the British to appreciate a devotional philosophy too subtle for their own imaginations. And this, of course, was the dreaming. And the dreaming wasn't a dream. It was a notion that life both existed in the moment, but was perpetually waiting to be born. In not one of the 670 languages and dialects of Australia is there a word for time or past, present, or future. There is only the dreaming. And what the Australian philosophy valued was not change, but constancy. Not progress, but stasis. The entire purpose of life in Australia was not to improve on anything, but rather to do the ritual gestures along the song lines in particular as they cross Yuroklan territory, the ritual gestures deemed to be necessary to keep the world exactly as it was at the time of its creation, at the time of the rainbow serpent. Now, the interesting thing about this is not to say who's right and wrong, but it's rather like if we in the West had done nothing but prune the shrubs in the Garden of Eden to keep it just as it was when Adam and Eve had that fateful conversation. Again, I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong. Had we followed this devotional trajectory, we would not have put a man on the moon, but on the other hand, we wouldn't be talking about global climate change and our capacity to transform the biological life support system of the planet. So if industry has one impact on indigenous people, and the cult of modernity is often employed to get people off the land so that companies can have access to natural resources on lands upon which the presence of indigenous people is an inconvenience, ideology is also a threat to culture. A photograph I took in Cambodia of a nun who had her feet and hands cut from her body during the terrible era of Pol Pot in the killing fields for the crime of pursuing the Dharma. And if we go to Tibet, where I was just 2 weeks ago, you can still hear the crunch of the jackboots on the spirit of Tibet of the Chinese Red Guard. When His Holiness as a young man was speaking with Mao Zedong, incidentally, the man who has a dubious distinction of having been responsible for the murder of more of his own people and the death of more of his own people in his lifetime than Hitler and Stalin put together. When Mao famously whispered in the ears of the Dalai Lama that all religion was poison, His Holiness knew what to expect. And when the final conquest occurred in 1959, 1.2 million Tibetans were killed for their religious faith. 6,000 temples, monasteries were obliterated. Now, how would we feel if a power like the United States swept into Canada and declared all of our religious faith to be anathema and proceeded to destroy all of our mosques, synagogues, and churches? Well, that's exactly what happened in Tibet. And what was it about the Buddhist Dharma that so threatened the Marxist materialists of Beijing? It all is distilled in the Four Noble Truths. All life is suffering. By that, the Buddha didn't mean that all life is negation. He just meant that shit happens. The second of the Noble Truths is the notion that the cause of suffering is ignorance. By that, the Buddha didn't mean the stupidity. He meant the tendency of human beings to cling to the cruel illusion of our own centrality in the stream of divine existence. The third of the Noble Truths was the revelation that ignorance could be overcome, and the fourth and most consequential was the delineation of a contemplative practice that, if pursued, had not just the possibility of a transformation of the heart, but a promise based on 2,500 years of empirical experience that such a transformation would occur. And so I wanted to make this film a Buddhist science of the mind, and what better companion than Mathieu Ricard? You can see that it was rather like traveling through Sherwood Forest with Friar Tuck. Mathieu was an extraordinary character. His father was France's most famous philosopher. His mother was a great painter. If you can believe it, he grew up in a house of luminaries in Paris, whereby he learned photography from Henri Cartier-Bresson. He learned to play piano from an elderly Stravinsky, and he learned anthropology at the feet of Levi-Strauss. He himself was a molecular biologist in the lab of a Nobel laureate at the Pasteur Institute outside of Paris, when one day he realized there was no correlation between fame, wealth, and happiness. And so he went back to the place he had always been happy, the mountains of the Himalaya, and became ordained as a Tibetan monk. And with me as well was Sherab Barma, traditional Amchi doctor, seen here quizzically examining my urine sample. And under the blessing of Trusik Rinpoche, the late Trusik Rinpoche, head of the Nyingma tradition, we embarked on a journey of the heart to encounter a bodhisattva, a true wisdom hero, on the flanks of Mount Everest. We weren't doing what many people do, seek out the Western heroes of Everest, men who and women who climb high into the cold rock, into a place of oxygen deprivation that ensures the obliteration of consciousness, which from the Tibetan point of view is just about the stupidest thing you could do. We wanted to go to be in the presence of a true wisdom hero. And we had heard about a woman who Sherrod was treating, who at the age of 15 had been betrothed forcibly to a merchant. She escaped his clutches by crawling down a human latrine and covered with human excrement, turned up at the Temboche monastery. The Lama cleaned her up, dispatched her in winter over the 23,000-foot Nangpala Pass into Tibet. She became ordained as a Tibetan nun, came back over the mountains, and then went into lifelong retreat. And for 45 years, she had lived in a cell in a nunnery, no bigger than the space behind me in the stage here. And Sherrod was treating her because she was old and frail, and that gave us an opportunity to go and meet her. So we began at the Shiwong Monastery, which clings like a swallow's nest to the mountains of Nepal, at the ceremony known as Mani Rimdu, which commemorates the transmission of the Dharma to Tibet over an 18-day ritual, a transmission, of course, in the time of Guru Rinpoche. And from the Mani Rimdu, we then began this incredible walk high into the Himalayas through a number of remarkable valleys, eventually reaching the sacred cave where Sherrod, as part of his 7 years of medical training, had spent 1 full year in solitary retreat, a cave to which he returns every year for a month of private meditation. Eventually reaching the east face of Everest. You can see Everest poking up on the far right in this unusual view from the Gama Valley, which is a verdant valley that very few travelers reach. And as Mathieu would read the sutras, we slowly made our way toward this nunnery. And this next photograph is a photograph that I took the instant the door opened to allow sunlight on the face of this woman for the first time in 45 years. Now, by the terms of reference of our culture, she should have been mad. But what greeted us was a woman whose face radiated loving compassion. She immediately began to give away all the merit for her spiritual deeds to all sentient beings. Her entire life had been dominated by the recitation of a single mantra, day and night. Now, what Mathieu said is that she, in a sense, was the proof of the efficacy of the science of the mind of Tibetan Buddhism, and that precisely is the serenity achieved by the practitioner. And when we left her to her meditations, we went to another monastery, and that night this Lama said to me this remarkable thing. He said, "No, we in Tibet don't believe you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe that we achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, but we do." So, in the Diamond Sutra, the Buddha speaks of life as being like a candle in the wind, a sunrise fading with the morning. And they leave it to us to explain why we continue to tolerate the wrath of China. A photograph I took just last week in Lhasa with the red banner dominating the Potala Palace, military in every corner of Lhasa, in every nunnery, secret cameras documenting every activity, every nuance of prayer. Lhasa, of course, has become a Han city. So in the end, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to live in? A monochromatic world of monotony, or do we want to celebrate a polychromatic world of diversity? Margaret Mead said before she died that her greatest fear was that as we drifted toward this blandly amorphous, generic world culture, not only would the entire range of the human imagination be reduced to a single modality of thought, but we would wake one day as from a dream, having forgotten that there were other possibilities of life itself. The goal isn't to isolate people in time or freeze people as if a zoological specimen. The question really is, what kind of world do we want to live in as we go forward? How do we find a way that cultures can choose the components of their lives? It's not the modern versus the traditional, the rights of free people to choose the parameters of their lives. And critically, how can we find a way that all peoples can benefit from the very best of the modern world without that engagement having to demand the death of their ethnicity? And this is the most important lesson to take away from the entire practice of anthropology, and that is the fact that culture is not trivial. Culture is not decorative. Culture is not the prayers we utter, it's not the costumes we wear, the dances we celebrate. Ultimately, culture is a body of ethical and moral values that every culture places around each individual human being to keep at bay the barbaric heart that history sadly teaches us lies within every one of us. It is culture that allows us to make sense out of sensation. It is culture that allows us to find order and meaning in a universe that has none. It is culture that allows us to do, as Lincoln said, always seek the better angels of our nature. And if you want to know what happens when culture is lost, and individuals, either through coercion or volition, turn their backs on tradition, perhaps aspiring to the images of a world that will always lie beyond them, often securing only a place on the lowest rung of an economic ladder that goes nowhere, finding themselves in a sea of disaffection, disappointment, and alienation, you have to only look at the points of cultural breakdown around the world. Pol Pot and his killing fields and his fantasy that he was going to sweep away all influences of the West. The shining path at the gates of Lima, the Maoists in their rampages in Tibet, the butt-naked brigades in Liberia, the madness of eastern Congo, or indeed the horrors of the genocide in Rwanda, pictures I took in Kigali at the Genocide Museum, Hutu and Tutsi pitted against each other through the manipulation of colonialism. Happily, nation-states are finally realizing that indigenous people do not embarrass a nation-state, they enrich it if that state's prepared to accept diversity. When the British first went to the Arctic, they took the Inuit to be savages. The Inuit took the British to be gods. Both were wrong, but one did more to honor the human race. And what the British failed to understand was that there was no better measure of genius than the ability to survive in that harsh environment on a technology that was limited to what you could carve from bone, slate, and forge from the cold. The Inuit didn't fear the cold, they took advantage of it. The runners of their sleds were originally made of fish, 3 Arctic char laid in a row and wrapped in the skin of a caribou hide. The Inuit didn't fear the cold, they took advantage of it. This is a photograph I took 250 kilometers out on the sea ice from Igloolik when I was polar bear hunting with some friends from there. And that night the temperature dropped to minus 65 Celsius before the wind came up. They simply made an igloo. We crawled into the skins, lit oil lamps, and ate raw meat. And despite what Greenpeace may tell you, in the Arctic, blood on ice is not a sign of death. It's an affirmation of life itself. And when I was narwhal hunting at the tip of Baffin Island with this couple, Martha and Olayak told me a story that I'm going to close with tonight. In the 1950s, a dark time in Canadian history, we forced the Inuit into settlements to establish our sovereignty in an archipelago that had gone back to the British or the Americans for that matter. And this man's grandfather categorically refused to leave the land. And so the family, fearful for his life, took away all of his tools and all of his implements, all of his weapons, thinking that that would force him into the settlement. Did it? No. In the middle of an Arctic night, with a blizzard blowing, the old man slipped outside of the igloo, pulled down his caribou hide and sealskin trousers, and defecated into his hand. As the feces began to freeze, he shaped it in the form of an implement. And when the tool took final shape, forged by the cold, he put a spray of saliva along the leading edge to make a sharpened edge. And with that implement, forged from human excrement by the cold, he killed a dog. He skinned the dog, improvised the traces of a sled with the skin of the dead dog, improvised a sled with the ribcage of the dead dog, harnessed up an adjacent living dog, and then shit knife and belt disappeared in the Arctic night. Now talk about getting by with nothing. Now, I'm not suggesting there's an assembly line creating shit knives in the Arctic. I thought initially they were pulling my leg until I read in the journals of Peter Freuchen, who traveled with Knut Rasmussen in the 5th Thule expedition, this great moment when he gets caught out in the barren lands in a blizzard. He makes a trough in the snow to get shelter, pulls his sled on top of him, and the ice and snow build up until he's made a coffin of his own creation. And in his journal, he literally says, I thought about how am I going to get out? I thought of making a shit knife, but I couldn't really maneuver, so I did this. So the thing is, in the Arctic, a towel left out overnight is a shovel by dawn. True or not, it's just too good a story not to end with. And it's a great symbol of the resilience of Inuit people, a resilience which, of course, is now being challenged by something beyond their control, and that's climate change. This is a photograph I took in the northernmost inhabited community on Earth, Qaanaaq in northwest Greenland, the only major community that still exclusively uses dogs. The ice normally comes in September and is still around in July. Now the ice comes in November and is gone by March. So literally within a single generation, their world has been, in a sense, sliced in half. And what they see is weather beyond their imaginings. And this is, of course, happening throughout the Arctic. And when I wrote the Massey Lectures, the editors put on that subtitle, Why Ancient Wisdom Matters in the Modern World, forcing me to answer that question, which I did implicitly in the lectures and in the text of the book. But in the end, I answered it fundamentally with two words: climate change. Not to suggest that we go back to some pre-industrial past or that we keep anyone from the brilliance of the best of the modern world, but rather to suggest that the very existence of all the myriad of other ways of thinking, other ways of being, other ways of orienting yourself on the planet puts the lie to those of us who say that we cannot change as we know we must change the fundamental way we inhabit this single orb of life. And in the end, the voices of the Inuit people, the prayers of these young Tibetan monks, and indeed the hopes of this Maasai warrior from the Serengeti, all are part of our geography of hope. Every culture has something to say. Everyone deserves to be heard. Every culture deserves a place at the Council of Human Wisdom and Knowledge. Thanks very much.